So, as mentioned, I run an online learning platform called Moon Learning, and what I do at Moon Learning, I talk about UI design, a lot of Figma, and the area that I like most and I teach most is where design and code, where they intersect. And whenever I say that, people get really excited because they say, oh, great, Christine, all we want to know is tell us how to hand this stuff off. So tell us how we hand it off to development, and then we never have to worry about it. But I'm really sorry to disappoint. I'm not so much into the handing off, but I'm much more about the understanding of. Because I believe that as designers and developers, we fundamentally have different mental models. And they come to light a lot, especially when we talk about layout. So what I want to do with you today is I want to make us understand each other's side. So we're going to run through all of these little beauties here. And it's really funny because I usually talk to designers more than developers, and usually the designers go like, oh my God, no. So I was told this is 70% developers, so you're probably like, are we going to do that basic stuff? So the thing we're going to do is, it's going to be about the designers understanding the part of the developers, the basic concept, and the developers understanding the things that we do in design, especially in Figma. Usually the next question is, can we have the slides? So yes, you can have the slides. And also, I'm going to run through some examples and some resources quite quickly. So I also set up the resources, the links that you can see, so you can download them there and read further, so you don't have to take any notes. I'm going to put that at the end again. So once upon a time, there was a designer, and this was a good designer. How do you see that someone is a good designer? They're dressed all in black, and they generally highly doubt their own ability. It's a very important skill for a designer. If you ever see a designer saying, I think I did really well on that design last week, run. Don't let them near your files. So that designer knew it's not only about setting up your design. It's about setting this up in components, creating a whole system. There were variables, hierarchy, typography, spacing, different screen sizes were thought after. And so all we had to do now is click that share button. And this is where the story really begins. Because like all big stories, there is this original source. Think of Hamlet, War and Peace, right? There is this document that we're going to hand down to the generations to come. And so do we have one. This is a Slack channel. So here goes our designer. So saying, hello, here's the link to the website design, which includes the necessary information for coding. I'll be away for an extended weekend. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Developer typing, never a good sign. Great, I'll have a look and get going. Fantastico, that worked out fine. Designer is off, enjoying the weekend. Nothing can go wrong. We did it all by the book. Until, hey, there are some problems with the design. You said to reach out anytime. So yeah, we do say that, but it's not really a thing. Anyways, of course, I'm always happy to chat. Just heads up, I'll be opting for a different layout approach, as the 12-column grid's a bit outdated. Okay, so what are we going to use instead? Oh, just the usual CSS layout stuff like Flexbox and so on. And now as a designer, you have two ways that you can take this. You want to go for A. I know you want to go for A. You want to say, sure, just do it, and then next week you're just going to cry because all of that thing in the browser just doesn't have anything to do with your Figma file. But you should really go for option B. I don't know what that means. Can you explain it to me? But the thing is, as a designer, I said, the self-doubt, and you're this expert, and it's just so strange, everything that's happening in code. So when, as a designer, we have to stand in front of the development team and say, I just don't understand how that works. It feels a bit like this. Because we think that everybody thinks this. You're a bad designer, and they're all going to find out. But I think that's also up to us designers, making that little flip in our head and just having a different approach. So I generally, when I look at developers, I see you like this. Like little fluffy, cute dogs. And I generally give you the benefit of the doubt that you probably want to tell me how all of that works. So when you see me today and I look at you, that's what I see. Aren't you cute? So when we get this offer of, do you want me to show you how that works on my side of the table? Then you say, yes, I would love to understand that. And this is usually the moment where we bring in a skilled developer, a front-end developer, to explain all of that, but budgets are tight. I really hate when people fiddle with my slides, so I'm just going to explain that to you. So we're going to really run through that. Developers, don't worry, we're getting to the design part as well. So the thing is, in design, when we do layout, we can drag our things around the canvas freely. And this is also why I believe we shouldn't jump right in the browser, because it's so much faster and we can have all this freedom in design. But when we go in the browser, then what happens is that things usually stack below one another. And what we need to use layout tools. So one of these layout tools we can use is CSS Flexbox to arrange these things. And how it works in a nutshell for the designers amongst you is that if we have 3 items, A, B, and C, what we do is we wrap these items and we apply the rule display flex, which turns this container into a so-called flex container. Now, what's really important to understand here is the parent and the child relationship. So this is now our parent, this container, and inside are our children. And all of these children are going to follow the parent's rules. So it's one rule the parent set for all the children, and they just do everything the parent says the same. It only works in the browser. I tried it in real life. It does not work in real families. So what it does, we can, let's just look at this. So what happens is we can run the alignment, so we can align it horizontally, vertically, we can add padding, we can add spacing, and you can see it's all the same rules to all the same children, and they will follow all of that. Now, Flexbox is all about democratic parenting. It's a really nice parent. So what's happening is that even though the children follow all of these rules, they have a bit of freedom themselves to develop freely. And so these are called the flex items. And the flex items, what they can do is they can have a percentage, they can have a fixed width, or they can have something called flex, which means that they're using up the rest of the available space. So if we have a simple component like this, then we can see the card, that's our Flexbox, the parent container, and then inside we have our children. They follow the same direction, they have the same spacing, the same padding around them, and then they can use up the space that they need, horizontally or vertically. And if we have more complex elements, then that works the same. We just sort of nest them into one another. So we have little families in little families. So we have the child looking up to the parent's rules, and that parent is a child itself to the next parent. And this way we can create those larger components. So it's all about having lots of little flexboxes in flexboxes. So it's all about nesting. Now, we can set up our components like this, we can group them further, and we could even create entire pages. And because of the nature of this, a lot of the time you will see that they already react really nicely to responsive design. So our designer now listens to this explanation and says, that is amazing, because you know what? I just noticed when I work in Figma and I use auto layout that literally is Flexbox. Let me show you. Actually, if you look in dev mode, I could have just looked there. I see all these weird things like flex and flex start and things like that. So I never knew what that means, but apparently that's Flexbox. So let me show you what it does in Figma. So there are 3 pillars. We have the auto layout menu, we have the resize menu, and we have nesting. And if we translate that, then we have container properties, item properties, and just general nesting. So let's have a look at that. So if we're in Figma, we can see that this is our menu where we set the alignment, we set the padding, the margin, the spacing, just as we saw with the container properties. Now, if we jump into the resizing, then that's also almost the same. So we have fixed, we have fill container, and we have hug container. So let me show you what that means. So fixed, as the name says, is a fixed size. Fill would translate to flex, and hug, that's basically the default in Flexbox, so it's just the content plus any padding that you put around. You can see that the others then react to it. And just in Flexbox, if we resize, then these things will react to our setting. We don't have everything the same, so it doesn't align perfectly. We don't have percentage in Figma. We have something that always translates to flex1. I'm using a short form here. And we cannot change the flex value, so that's a bit limiting indeed. The nesting, that also works pretty much the same. And what happens if you use auto layout the first time, then you probably do this and that happens. This is why a lot of people get really frustrated with auto layout, because the concept of nesting and Flexbox, you need to understand it in order to use it well. So again, when we're designing, we're having all on the same hierarchy layer, and I think that is great to move really fast and to get to our idea. But what we need to do in Figma, when we're ready to clean all of this up, is that we need to tidy up the structure. We need to think of the nesting. We need to think of each little element, which is a good thing because we're getting a bit closer to the real thing. And once we've done that, now our things are resizing really nicely as we want them to. You're living at a great time because Figma is adding their AI tools. So what we can do now, we can right-click and then we can choose Suggest Auto Layout, and then Figma is automatically nesting all of this for us. I think it's a really great thing. I'm still a big advocate that you should understand Flexbox, you should understand how to nest, because you want to make changes, you want to be in control. But it's a great way to speed up your workflow for sure. And just as we saw with Flexbox earlier, we can also set up these pages in Figma. So our designer, now developer, they did that, they understand their tools, and we have a new person entering the room, the project manager. We love our project managers, don't we? So here we go. So the developer did a fantastic job. Here we go. Our website is live, and the project manager says, why do these cards shuffle so strangely? Why don't they align? Can we fix that, please? Okay, panic. The designer goes back to Figma. I cannot do it. I don't know. It doesn't work. I tried everything. But we're friends with the developers now. Don't worry. No worries. We just need CSS Grid here. Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout tool. We need 2 dimensions. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So let's jump in. What's CSS Grid? One of my favorites here. So CSS Grid, let's remind ourselves with Flexbox. So what Flexbox does, it puts all of these little elements in a row. It's like one item after the other. So if you're changing them, it moves them up and down. There's something called wrap that you can do. You can also do that in Figma. And this is a one-dimensional layout tool. So that means it doesn't care what's happening in that first row. It just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever you put there. If you want something like this, then you need another tool. So you need a 2-dimensional layout tool, and this is CSS Grid. There isn't one better or one worse, they just do fundamentally different things, 1 axis or 2 axes. So if you think of Flexbox like beads on a string, then CSS Grid, you take those beads and you put them into a bento box. And it's a really cool bento box because you can join compartments, add compartments. It's really fantastic, it's really versatile. And here is when I say about the mental models that are different between design and development. And if you're taking away one thing of that talk, or wake up, this is what I want you to remember. When you say grid to a designer, we think of that. We think of pink little lines, and then we place our items in there. There are thousands of articles. This is what we've learned. Usually when you say grid to a front-end developer, they think of that. They think of grid lines and a CSS grid. And that is really different, even though you can mimic the same things. Because what the grid lines do, they're much more powerful. It's like a coordinate system. So I can add my items per default like this, but I can target specific areas. And I can create those areas, I can overlap. And so you can see this is so much more powerful than these little pink lines. And we need to understand and talk about these different concepts, because otherwise we say the same word and we mean different things. We can also create columns with a CSS grid, but they don't have to be all equal. We don't have this same gutter, this same column thing happening. We need to understand a new unit, which is the fractional unit. So that means we're working with fractions of the area that we have available. So we can mix fixed areas, fractional units. We can have 2FR, 1FR. And as we resize, these things react really nicely to the changing size of the browser. Now, what I showed you, I'm just giving you a very, very short intro of this because CSS Grid is really mighty. What I want to point out is that what I show you, and again, what's easier for designers to understand, is the so-called explicit grid. So that means we have this grid, and we vision this grid, and then we fill it with the design. But CSS Grid also works as an implicit grid. So you give it the items you have, and it creates the grid for you, which is a really strange concept as a designer, because we're so used to sort of having these items and arranging them. So I really encourage you, go and have a look at the browser, how these things work, to get a feel. Because for some areas where you don't know how many items you're going to have, it's really good to use these different systems. Now, if you say, I just want my columns, that's totally fine. We can create under the hood these columns and just work with them. But we can just go beyond, so we can break that, we can create new things, and we can go out of this completely. So we can create really, really creative new designs with CSS Grid that weren't possible before. Whatever you use, usually they react really nice to changing screen sizes. And as you can see here, the world is your oyster, which can also be very overwhelming. So sometimes you just want to take it back a notch as a designer and use your traditional grid. Now, the next question you probably have in mind, so which one do I use? Am I going to use Flexbox or CSS Grid? And it's not one or the other. They're part of the CSS family, so they go really beautifully hand in hand. So you might have your components set up in Flexbox and then a CSS Grid around. Some areas might be better set up in Flexbox entirely and then mixed with some CSS Grid areas. And something I see lately, which I personally really love, is having components themselves being set up in CSS Grid. There is no fixed rules, and the way that this is going to be built, you cannot find out how to do that in Figma. You're not the person making those decisions. These decisions lie by the front-end developer. But it's really great if you understand what's happening and why things might look different in a browser. And this is generally a good thing, because a browser is more powerful than your tool. So the designer listened to that and said, OK, great, but the problem is I don't have that in Figma, so I don't really know what to do with all of this info. And let's think about it when we approach this, because I struggled a lot with that personally, because I had all these possibilities, but I couldn't really use them. So what I generally do before I start a project is I have a look, is this sort of the arty project, like the award-winning one-pager, things fly in, fly out, or is this a system? Is this a design system that has to work, that has to scale? So if we're looking at the arty one, then in general, you just have to design your general layout, and it comes alive in the browser. There's a really great page, this is also in the resources, by Jen Simmons. She's like the goddess of CSS Grid. And she has a fantastic page where she shows that she took old Bauhaus posters and she recreated them, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So you see here how she goes from the static image to this really, really beautiful dynamic behavior. This is nothing you can ever try out in your design software. This has to come alive in the browser, and you have to dedicate all of this art, all of this crafting to the browser. So you need to discuss these things. Where do the resources go? Where does the time go? And if you're working more on a systematic approach, which usually is our daily bread and butter for most of us, then what we can do here is we can just use the tools that we already know. So we can use our grids, and we don't need to worry under the hood how this is going to be working, because it will work. So you can use those grids. They're great tools. In Figma, you can set up your grids. You can add them. Your components are in auto layout. You put them to your grid. You fix them with your constraints, and then you can create these layouts. It's absolutely fine. If you're saying, however, well, I'm not sure how this is going to be built, and I don't want to use these rigid grid systems. What I personally do is that I just have some reference sizes, and then I just let the developers create whatever is happening between these sizes. That doesn't mean that I'm handing over a static image of something. In the background, all of these things are thought through. There's a hierarchy, there are variables, there are components, breakpoints, everything is thought through. There's a solid documentation. But the little things that the browser does better, I let it happen in the browser. Wouldn't it be cool to have CSS Grid in Figma? Well, we don't, but we have it in Penpot. Do we have anybody from Penpot here? It's really funny, because I promise you, I have this slide in there, even if you're not sponsoring the conference I'm speaking on, which is really funny. So I still do hope I get invited to a karaoke party now. So Penpot is really cool. I do run a Figma learning platform, but I still have to say, I'm a really big fan that actually Penpot took that on, and I stole a little video of your website where you see that really nice, because what Penpot does is that you actually do have a grid layout. And I find it really fantastic, because here you can see we're getting the units. As designers, we're seeing fractions units. We can mix fixed and fluid. We can create these areas. And so we're getting actual output that we can use for the browser. I'm sure there is still a lot of conversation to have, but just that as designers we can learn and see these tools in action, I think is really amazing. And also they have the same for their Flex layout, so we're much closer to Flexbox there as well. So I really encourage you to have a look. Project Manager is there, great, all of it is working, we cleared it up. Great, we have client feedback. We send our page off and there is nothing a designer loves more than client feedback. So here we go, let's see what our lovely client has to say. Thank you for your work. After reviewing the design with my wife and all my cousins, even second degree, we noticed the text doesn't adjust in size across devices. Could you please make this adjustment? P.S. I've created a design in PowerPoint, so it should be quick for you to implement. I hear you laughing. You feel me, don't you? Great. Okay, let's get to this. We generally really love that sort of stuff. Okay, great. Breakpoints. So what about breakpoints? So what are they? We ask our developer. Quick intro. So the breakpoints, these are, as the name says, these points where our design breaks, where we make these big decisions. Does our layout change? Do we need to show and hide things? And how they work in CSS is that we have something called a media query. So our media query has a rule. So I'm using Pixel just to illustrate it. Wouldn't be like that in real life. So we say if a certain condition is met, so a certain width, for example, then whatever happens in the curly bracket, becomes active. So let me show you a really bad code example that I made. So you can see here there is some typography, and then once our screen is larger, then the typography increases. So if we have our standard column-based design, then what happens is that usually our grid changes and we can change the distribution that our items use up on that grid. And we can change our components, for example, so like a burger menu to a links menu. And what we can also do and should do for sure is to reconsider our typography. So especially our headlines, they're not going to work from a small mobile into a larger one. If you're working the very old way, so this is what we've learned, this is where all of this comes from Bootstrap, you can see all of these breakpoints. But what happens in our approach that we looked at? What happens with CSS Grid and Flexbox? So we generally, as you saw, we don't really need these breakpoints, but you still probably want to have some here and there. So you might want to have them to change your component, like I showed, like to have these drastic changes, and also for your typography. So this is a really important one, and even though you can, as you saw in the example earlier, you can handcraft this all and make these breakpoints, especially to where the little nitty-gritty breaks. In a system, you probably want to define some breakpoints and then make your changes there for your typography, and you're going to end up with your classic scale, which is really fantastic because you can create this also in Figma in styles. There is another tool that's really great in CSS, and that is Clamp. And so what Clamp does basically is that we can lock it. So we have a minimum size, then it grows nicely, and then we lock it again at the maximum size. So we have this beautiful fluid typography happening. So Clamp looks like this. So we have a minimum size that we define, we have a maximum, and then we have a rate of scale. The unit here is the viewport width, so that's the width of the viewport, a percentage. So when it changes, then this percentage will obviously have another output. And you can see here that it's very important that this does not rely on breakpoints. So it's like a little closed system in itself. It's really fantastic, but again, this has to be carefully considered with your development team. There needs to be accessibility questions need to be answered. In a design system, it might be a little tricky, but have it in mind if you're having this one headline, this one thing where you would need this. So as a designer, you look at this and you say, okay, let me sum this up for you, developers, what we can do. If we're using this classic grid thing, this is how everything was designed, and this is what Figma also gave us. We have grids, we can set this up, I can save them as styles, and that's super easy. I can create my hierarchy, and then I can just use that according to the breakpoints. And what we could also do, if we're using a more modern approach, then I'm just going to give you these designs like as we saw before, and I'm still going to add some breakpoints that we decide on, and we can still use this type scale for all of us. Now, what happens in Figma, though, when you start working with this, is what you're going to notice is you have your components, and you want to use these components, and they work quite well across these different screen sizes. But your typography that doesn't adjust. So you would need to, in your instances, sort of switch in and override styles, which is something a bit ugly. You don't want to override styles, really. But there is a great new way to do that. So you can combine styles, variables, and modes in Figma now to do that. So what we can do is we can literally tie this to modes. So if we drag our components and our styles to a page with a different set mode for our different breakpoints that we define together as a team, then I pull in automatically the right variable with the right size. So this is really great. I have as well a free tutorial in the links later on if you're interested in how to build this. Now, as designers, we can't use Clamp. We don't have a tool like Clamp. So if we would want to use that, we need to sit down as designers and developers, and we need to define how to show this in our files and how to hand this over to development so they will work on this, and we need to look at the browser together. OK, our project manager is back. Hi, everyone. What's happening now? Let's see. Regarding responsive behavior, our new intern just sent me this TikTok video about container queries, hot new thing. So we should be using these, I think. OK, let's look at container queries. Great, the developer's also loving this one. And let's have a look. Who loves container queries? I can see you really badly. I hope some hands go up. If you get very few hands, I'm going to show you because you're going to love container queries. They're absolutely amazing. I'm a huge fan. I think they're the coolest thing in responsive design ever. And so let's have a look what they are. So let's remind ourselves of media queries, which is the traditional thing that we use for responsiveness. So we have our media query, which has the add media, and then it looks at the viewport width. So the container, here we see it again, so then we have these breakpoints, and then we see at a certain breakpoint, depending on the viewport, we can change our design. Now, container queries, they look pretty much the same. And I'm just showing you the size container queries, there are more. And we can see that it's at container, but then the same sort of setup. And then, however, what they do is they don't look at the viewport, but they look at the container that holds our component. And this is super powerful, because what it does is that we can basically create the perfect component for the size we're using anywhere. So you can see as soon as you have more space available, you look like this or you look like this. And this is a designer's dream come true. So here's an example of a page, and you can see this is the same component used all over this page. But what we see is that this component looks fundamentally different, and you can do show, hide, you can do all sorts of stuff, depending on how much space it has available. So you're always going to get the best visual output depending on where you put your component, which I think is absolutely amazing. Designer looks at that and says, I'm really sorry, I don't even have media queries yet in Figma, so I definitely don't have that stuff happening soon. But as you showed me this, I had an idea, if we want to start working on this, how we could plan for this. So the element being queried is not the container, it's the container. But the responsive information, that is held by our component. And I can do that in Figma, because I can create a component in a component set with variants. And so I could sort of just like use them in a way that I show my different variations on different sizes here. So I can just create a little playground, and then I can test how this component looks at its best, and I'm just going to play around with it. And when I found a perfect size and a perfect layout for these different moments where my component breaks instead of my page, then what I can do, I can just document that for you in my Figma file. So I can just physically write that in there, but I can also add it in auto layout with min and max values. So you can't resize this component any larger. And then that would mean that if anybody uses that component, so let's have a look here. If we pull out an instance of that component, you see an add container property, which will probably confuse people, which is good. So they're going to be like, what's that? And we can add some documentation. And also in dev mode, you're going to see this add container, and then we can start planning for this. It's a bit hacky, but it's a great way to start thinking about these things and bringing them alive as a team. OK, we've finished all of that. We're pretty much done, aren't we? So again, client feedback. It was sent off. We did all this great new stuff. Thank you for your work, but can you make it pop more? Also, I think the logo should be bigger. And there's absolutely nothing I can do for you. So they lived happily ever after. But I'm not finished, because I have another tool that I absolutely love that I want to show you. Because the reality is, In our example, even though all of your developers are cute, fluffy dogs, sometimes maybe you're not. And so design and development, sometimes there isn't this conversation. Not because we're bad people, but maybe because in different countries, we speak different languages, there is just so much stress and there just isn't this moment where we can have this conversation and learn from each other. So for the designers, I still really encourage you to look at this, and it's a little challenging sometimes to get into this. So I really love this tool called Cursor. Again, I'm going to do a hand show. I can't see you who uses Cursor. Very few, very few. So what Cursor is basically, it's a code editor, and that runs on LLMs. So when you go on the Cursor website, you see this. So as a designer, you probably look at this and you're like, I really don't know what I should do with this. Don't worry, I also don't understand a thing that's happening up there. But the great thing about Cursor is that you can use it in a very different way as well. So what you can do, you just download it, it's free, and then you have this little chat box, like the ChatGPT box, runs on Claude. And you can just ask it stuff. So you can say, hey, I want to set up a page. How does that work? And it's going to show you this is HTML. You can add it. And you're not in this black box. You're seeing the code output. You can type in. You can ask questions. It's really like you're having this incredibly patient developer sitting next to you, answering all your questions. You can like highlight stuff and ask what it does. You can copy over your things from your Figma dev mode. So you can say, I want to change this typography. I want to create these things. And you can really start building these little pages and get familiar. And the topic that we just discussed now is you can say, can you tell me how to make a page responsive? And you can see it's going to explain you about Flexbox, it's going to explain you about CSS Grid. You can tell it, give me examples. I still don't understand. Make it super basic. And this way, you can really learn about these things and you can really tap in. And I think this is such a great opportunity that as designers, we can get so much closer and really start playing with these things while still staying in our tools. So I hope this shows that we can really go from handing off to understanding off, and with these new tools and development, hopefully also some of you, we can jump into a little bit of the making of. So I hope I make it worth your while that you can scan the code now. And thank you so much for your attention.